This morning, if you would, turn with me to Exodus chapter 2. I'd like to read verses 1 through 10. I'll be reading from the New International Version this morning. And it says this: Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, the New American Standard says beautiful child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to go get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked the Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. And the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." Today is Mother's Day, and it is a day that we set aside to remember and to honor our moms. For many, it's a happy day. For some, it's a hard day. Some don't have good memories of their mother. Some have been unable to have children. For others, it is just a reminder of maybe estranged or children that never come to visit or never make contact. I know that when we were younger, Melanie and I, a long, long time ago, we had a couple that was friends of ours, and they struggled having kids. And I know that every Mother's Day for a long time that it brought her to tears because she desired to have kids and couldn't have them. And eventually they did. They had a little boy, and Kathy went back for her postpartum checkup, and the doctor asked her, she said, "Well, what kind of precautions are you taking? What kind of," and Kathy's like, "Nothing. If you knew how much trouble we had having this kid, you wouldn't even be asking." And the doctor said, "Well, I'll see you in about a year." And about 12 months later, she gave birth to Dalton. So God can move in amazing ways. But this morning, I want to look at a mother that we hardly even know. We know very, very little about her. Her name is Jochebed. So Moses' parents, his dad was named Amram, and his mother was named Jochebed. In the passage of Scripture that we read this morning, she's not even named, right? But as we look at Moses and the man that he became, I want to look at the influence that Amram had, or that Jochebed rather had on him to make him who he decided to be. Now, there's some things that you need to understand in order for this story to take place. So, if we're going to go back, we're going to get into the Wayback Machine, and we're going to go further back. And so, Abraham had Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. One of those sons was Joseph. And if you remember, I'm not going to go into all of that this morning, but Joseph was one of the sons that Jacob loved a little more than he did the others, right? Because he was Rachel's son. So there's a lot there. I'm just not going to go there. Or we'll be way, way over. Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, into Egypt. And while he is there, he gets sold as a slave. And because he is honorable, when Potiphar's wife sees him, he's handsome, he's buff, he's attractive, I don't know, whatever. Potiphar's wife starts to pursue Joseph. And Joseph says, I can't do this. It would be wrong for Potiphar. It would be wrong, because God says that it's wrong. And as a result of that, he ends up in jail. While he's in jail, because he does what is right, because God blessed him, even in jail, he comes to the place where he's kind of in charge of all of the prisoners, even though he's a prisoner himself. And through a series of events, Joseph ultimately becomes second in charge of Egypt and in charge of the grain during a time of great famine. And so during that time of famine, it doesn't just affect Egypt, it affects Canaan as well. And so Joseph's family is starving. And so they come down to Egypt in order to get grain. And ultimately, long story short, too late, right? Long story short, Joseph reveals himself and he has his family move down to Egypt with him. And they settle in the land of Goshen, which is a part of Egypt. And over time, Joseph's family, Abraham's family, expands greatly to the point that Pharaoh is concerned that they will become more powerful than the Egyptian people. And so he passes this edict or law that all male-born children are to be killed. All the male babies, the female ones are fine, but all the male babies are to be killed. And that's where we come in at this story in Exodus chapter 2. The Bible says that Jochebed has this baby, and she sees that he is beautiful. She looks at him. She can tell that he is special. And so in defiance to Pharaoh's edict and command, she hides Moses for about 3 months. I don't even know how she did that. That'd be tough, right? Because they forced the Canaan or the Israelite people into servitude. They're building the pyramids. They're doing all of this stuff. They've become slaves in Egypt. There's another thing here that I want you to understand as we come to the first point of the message this morning, and that is this. They've been slaves in Egypt for probably a little over 300 years. Now, in America, we're getting ready to celebrate our 250th anniversary as a nation. And you look at the amount of time that America has been here. Imagine being people who are enslaved for even longer, right? The total time is over 400 years that they end up in slavery before Moses leads those people out of Egypt. The other thing that I want you to understand is that at the time of Amram and Jochebed, right, Moses' parents, there are no scriptures. There's no Bible. There's no Old Testament scriptures that they can use because God, when he started dealing with people, dealt in a patriarchal system. In other words, he dealt with family heads. And so God might deal with Dale, and it was Dale's job to make sure that his rest of his family and his children and his grandchildren and great-grandchildren understood what they were supposed to do and how they were supposed to serve God. That's kind of the way that it worked in that system. It isn't until Moses, wandering around in the wilderness, that we get the first 5 books of the Bible, because it's Moses who will write Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So up to this point, all that they know about God has been passed on from generation to generation, from father to son. And so I find it amazing, incredible, that Amram and Jochebed had this powerful kind of faith that allowed them to trust God and to defy Pharaoh. There's 3 things that I think that we can see in the way that Jochebed influenced Moses this morning, even though we know so very little about her. The first is this: we can see that she sacrificed for her son. She sacrificed for her son. In Exodus 2:3 it says, "But when she could no longer hide him, she got a little basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the edge of the Nile River." Remember, Pharaoh's law was that all Hebrew baby boys were to be put to death. And so Jochebed went through great sacrifice in order to hide him and to keep him safe until that was just absolutely not possible anymore. And then, when it became apparent that she could no longer hide Moses, she made a plan to keep Moses safe. So, you remember, she obtains this basket, she waterproofs the basket, and she doesn't just put Moses in there and set him adrift. She has a plan, right? She knows that Pharaoh's daughter is going to come to bathe in the Nile. And so she makes sure that Moses and his basket is where Pharaoh's daughter is going to be. And she just didn't leave it to fate. Because who does she send to watch over Moses while he's in the basket? Jochebed sends Miriam, which is Moses' sister, to make sure that Moses is safe. And so we see a mom who looks out for her child even when she's unable to take care of that child herself. But we also see God's plan and his work involved in there as well. Because you remember, when Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses and sees him, do you remember what Miriam does? Miriam comes up to Pharaoh's daughter and says, "Hey, how would you like it if I found somebody who could nurse the baby for you?" Guess who she finds to nurse the baby? Mom. We don't know very much about Jochebed. Very, very little. This story is the vast majority of what we know about Jochebed. But we know that she sacrificed for her son. And moms are all about sacrifice. For those of you who are mothers, I'm sure that there are times when you thought that if you couldn't get just a little bit of sleep, you just didn't know how you were going to make it, but you did it anyway. You got up all through the night to make sure that your child got Tylenol when they had a fever. You cleaned up after them. My wife was like the most amazing person doing dirty diapers that I've ever seen. I've never seen anyone who could get so much stuff wiped up in the dirty diaper before she ever had to go to the wipies, right? That's not a fun job. But moms do it, right? Because they sacrifice for their children. My mom, hardly ever got a new dress because she made sure that her kids had new clothes when they needed them. In the same way that Jochebed sacrificed for her kids, moms today sacrifice for their children as well. You do it in time. You do it in effort. You do it in so many, many different ways. But you are teaching your kids, and how you respond as a parent is going to be their first instinct when they become a parent themselves. When I was growing up, most of the discipline happened from my mom. And my mom honestly admitted to the fact that she said the reason that she did that is because she didn't think my dad would be strict enough, which is probably true. I got a lot of spankings. I probably had calluses on my bottom when I was growing up, but I deserved every single spanking I got, plus more. But my mom was a very smart lady, and for a long time, every Sunday after we would come home from church, it would be Debbie and David upstairs, Dan, drop them. I just had a hard time sitting still. But my mom was a very smart lady. And my mom, it didn't take my mom very long to figure out that spankings were not the best way to discipline me. Because 30 minutes later, it doesn't hurt anymore and you're back on your way doing what you want to do. I love to be outside. And so the punishment of choice for my mom became grounding to the house for a week. Now, if my dad grounded me, he might remember or he might not. But if my mom grounded me, you could count it down to the minute. There was never any early reprieves. And I'm certain that it was just as much punishment for my mother as it was for me. But my mom understood that was way more effective on me than the spankings were, right? Because I wanted to be outside. I wanted to do things. I wanted to be out there with my friends. And to be stuck in the house on a fantastic summer day was a horrible, horrible thing. Moms sacrifice for their kids. A second thing that we can see is that she taught him to choose God. She taught him to choose God. Acts 7, verses 21 through 25. When they put Moses outside, the king's daughter adopted him and raised him as if he were her own. The Egyptians taught Moses everything they knew, and he was a powerful man in what he said and in what he did. Now, I want you to catch that again. Some translations say that he was powerful in both word and in deed. Right? So in his words and in his actions. When Moses was about 40 years old, he thought it would be good to visit his own people, the people of Israel. Moses saw an Egyptian mistreating an Israelite, so he defended the Israelite and punished the Egyptian by killing him. Now I want you to notice verse 25. Moses thought his own people would understand that God was using him to save them, but they did not. Where in the world do you think Moses got the idea that God intended to use him to deliver the Israelites from captivity? It certainly wasn't Pharaoh's daughter. It certainly wasn't anyone in the palace of Pharaoh. It had to be Moses' mother. during the time that she spent weaning Moses, I can imagine in my mind that every single day she told Moses, God is going to do big things with you. God is going to use you to deliver his people. And 40 years later, that was still a part of Moses' life. She taught Moses that she taught him to choose God. And ultimately what Moses ends up doing is he chooses God over the cushy life of a prince of Egypt. Because of what he does, Moses will end up fleeing Egypt for his life, and he will spend the next 40 years of his life in Midian. It's interesting that we find out in Scripture that Moses lived to be 120 years old, and that his life can be divided into 3 40-year segments. The first 40 years of his life, he spends being raised as a prince of Egypt, as one of Pharaoh's sons. Moses received the very best education that the entire world at that time had to offer. The next 40 years, he'll spend in the wilderness in Midian, raising sheep. I know that Don likes sheep. I've always been a little offended in the Bible that we're referred to as sheep because they're not very smart animals. They're good animals, but they're not very smart. You've heard that old saying, saying, how many sheep do you have if one jumps off a cliff? Well, the answer is 0, because the rest of them will follow the first sheep off the cliff, right? When I was growing up, I worked for an old farmer, and we did the stuff that nobody else wanted to do. We ran electric fence, for the cows, and we put in fence posts, and we shoveled sheep dip, and all kinds of fun stuff like that. And I remember this one time, we were out, and one of the sheep had gotten out. And so Voss told us that we need to go try and catch this sheep. And David and I, we chased this sheep across 40 acres. It's crazy. And we finally got the sheep cornered. And my brother grabs him by the back leg. And the sheep peed on him and he let go. I'm like, what did you let go for? The damage was already done. And we never did get the sheep. But even amongst the sheep, there'll be one that they follow. And so when we would go and look, whatever we were doing with the sheep, checking on them, make sure one wasn't on its back or caught its head in a fence or something, Voss could point out the sheep that all of the rest of the sheep followed. Moses spent the next 40 years of his life taking care of sheep, looking to find places where they could eat, places where they could drink, watching out for these animals that are unable to take care of themselves. And that was important because the last 40 years of his life, Moses would be leading a different kind of sheep, people sheep, right, in the wilderness. And God spent 80 years getting Moses ready for the job that he was going to do. 40 years giving him the very best education the world had to offer. 40 years teaching Moses how to find, shelter and water and, lead things that can't take care of themselves. And then when God finally calls him, do you remember at the burning bush what Moses says? God, I think you should find somebody else. I don't talk very good. right? Have you seen my brother Aaron? He can, sing like an angel and talk like a preacher. I think you should find him. But God's assessment in Exodus was that he was powerful in both word and deed. But Moses' mother did something special. She taught Moses to choose God. And it was something that even after she was no longer in the picture, 40 years later, that Moses had never forgot. Some of you, are there phrases that you remember today that your mom used to say that have stuck with you all of these years? Melanie's mom had one of those phrases. Pretty is as pretty does. And there's a lot of times that I stop and I think about what Melanie's mom, Marilyn, used to say. The same thing is true for each of us. You have the ability as parents and grandparents to influence your children and your grandchildren in a way that you become the voice that's in their head that reminds them of what's right when the rest of the world is telling them what to do wrong. When I was growing up, my mom and dad made it very clear to me that they had no problem being the bad guy. That if I was ever in a situation where I knew what the right thing was and I was being pressured to do the wrong thing, they made it very clear that they had no problem with being the bad guy in the situation. That if I needed to say, I'd love to do that, but if my mom and dad found out, they would just absolutely ground me forever. They said they had no problem with that, right? Because they wanted me to do the right thing. And maybe the voice that reminds us from our parents, even still today, shows us that the influence that we have on our kids can be a mighty, mighty thing. And then the final thing is that she taught him that he could be great. In Acts 7:25, it says, Moses thought his own people would understand that God was using him to save them, but they did not. Moses' mother had to be the one. There's just not a single doubt in my mind that she was the one who reminded him over and over and over that God had big plans for Moses. God's going to do big things with you someday. And, as parents, as moms, and as dads, we have the ability to invest into our kids so that they hope and strive for what is best. I remember, my mom got her bluff in early. I don't know what she did, but to this day, if my mom said jump, I would be saying how high on the way up, because that's just the kind of person that she was. And I know that she loved us, and I know that I never doubted any of that. But I remember this one time. Now, I got in trouble a lot. Absolutely I did. And my mom once told me, she said, it was like you were thinking to yourself, and you're like, I know that I'm going to get in trouble for this, but it's worth it, right? I did stuff because I was curious, and it got me into trouble. My brother, he was a lot more deliberate in some of the stuff that he did. He was excellent at just knowing what bothered you and just digging at it, right, until it just drove you crazy. And some of the things that he did were more deliberate, right? And so I remember this one time that my mom sat my brother down at the table, and they were having a heart-to-heart, a come to Jesus meeting there. And she made this statement, and I never forgot it. She said, I can't make you do the right thing, but I can sure make you sorry that you did it. And that has always stuck with me. I have never forgotten that, even though it wasn't even directed at me, right? But Jochebed invested in Moses, even though it was a short time, in such a way that he knew without a shadow of a doubt that God had big plans for him and that God would do great things with him. In our society today, we have a whole world that's constantly pounding on our kids, that are trying to beat them down. You have the opportunity to be that voice in their head that tells them that they are special, that they are God's child, and that they're created in God's image. You know, I don't know what my mom did, but my mom and dad instilled in me this belief that I could do anything that I wanted to do as long as I wanted to do it bad enough. And that has been very helpful for me throughout the years. Moms, you have a tremendous task. You have a tremendous responsibility. And it comes with a great reward. I still, to this day, remember Melanie with each one of our kids when they were born. And the hours that she spent holding them and just memorizing every single detail of each of our kids. The number of times that she counted their toes and their fingers. You know, she could have identified them by every wrinkle, I think, as she just spent hours and hours just memorizing each and every feature of all of our kids. God's blessed you. Take that responsibility seriously. And, you know, for some of you who are not parents, or your kids have already grown up, understand that you still have the opportunity to influence your grandkids and your great-grandkids and your nieces and your nephews and even the young people that are around you. You can be the difference. You can be the voice that's inside their head that says you're special. You're special, even in a world that tries to tell you that you're not. Thank you, moms, for all that you do.